"Aquino, observe strict blackout in turrets," I shouted. We raced headlong for the target. At 2,700 meters, Amatsukaze came around to port, bringing all guns to bear directly on the submarine. "Shine searchlight. Open fire," I yelled. The submarine showed up clearly and the first salvo followed. I saw 7 crewmen running around helplessly on the deck. A moment later, 2 yellow explosions burst among them, followed 5 seconds later by the second salvo. One of these 6 shells hit the target. Then the third salvo, and again one direct hit. The submarine blazed fiercely. Hitsukaze's first salvo was over. The second salvo barely missed, and there was no third salvo. The submarine sank so fast that it had disappeared among the waves before we arrived at the spot. We dropped 6 depth charges to cinch the job. We cut down our speed to 12 knots and combed the area together with Hitsukaze. Our sonars did not pick up any targets, but the area smelled strongly of heavy oil. We abandoned the search at 3:59 and left the scene. 2 hours later we returned to the same area, because I wanted Amatsukaze's crew to view the heavy oil on the surface. Only a few officers on the bridge and the gun crew had seen the burning sub. I decided it was important to show everyone the fruit of their great strain and efforts. Oil was still rising at the place where the sub had sunk. It stretched out for miles on the surface of the sea, and the scene made a great impression on my crew. My elation over our first definite kill was diminished by the fact that our victim had already been in trouble when we attacked. It was too much like cold-blooded murder to sink a ship that could offer no resistance. We continued our hunt the following night, though the weather was quite bad, with intermittent driving rain. The big binoculars were almost useless because rain drenched their lenses. Visibility was not more than a few thousand meters. Around 20:30 I saw a dim, flickering, yellowish light several thousand meters away on Amatsukaze's starboard bow. It blinked once and swiftly disappeared, like the flick of a lighted match. I pulled out my pocket binoculars and gazed in the same direction. Yes, someone was on deck smoking a cigarette. I estimated the distance as 4,000 meters almost due north and forward of Amatsukaze's course. The destroyer quickly picked up speed and dashed forward through the dark with all hands ready at battle stations. The target was made out to be a surfaced submarine. It was moving to the east at fairly good speed. We boosted speed to 26 knots and swung left to bring Amatsukaze on a parallel heading with the sub at a distance of 2,300 meters. Our searchlight showed the target to be a medium-sized submarine. The first salvo roared. All the shells were over. The next moment, I saw 2 sinister lines of foam running a few feet ahead of our bows. "Torpedoes!" someone shouted, and a chill went down my spine. My dread was forgotten a few seconds later when 2 shells of our second salvo landed on the target. Amatsukaze was up to 30 knots, and the enemy torpedoes had missed us. There was a third salvo, which scored one more hit, as fire broke out on the conning tower of the submarine. The flaming ship vanished quietly into the waves. We swung rapidly to port and dashed to the submersion scene. 6 depth charges were dropped. The sea billowed and boiled in the dark, and all was still but for the rain. There was no question about the fate of this enemy. We cleared out at 23:45 after combing the area for possible sonar contacts. There were no signs that the sub was alive. Weather cleared the following day, and we returned to the scene of the night's action, 39 miles, bearing 245 degrees from Bowen Island. This spot, too, was marked by a long path of heavy oil. It rose to the surface like smoke belching from an undersea volcano. The crew was again called out to see the results of their teamwork. They were not as exhilarated as on the previous evening, but they looked contented and satisfied. While the crew was thus assembled on deck, I took the opportunity to speak to them. "You have seen the good results of our combined efforts. I am thoroughly satisfied with your fine job. We have been through much together in the months since this war started, without losing a single soul. Let us hope our good fortune may continue. You have done a fine job, but more will be expected of you from now on. Look at the stream of oil. That oil comes from an enemy submarine that has been turned into a huge casket for its crew of more than 100 men. They died because of the unpardonable stupidity of one man who smoked on the surface deck. I saw the match he lit, and that gave us the initiative. Enemy seamanship was good. Their torpedo marksmanship was terrific. Despite all our advantage, Amatsukaze survived only by a very close shave. But for one stupid, careless man breaking blackout by smoking, this destroyer might well have been sunk and all 250 of us killed. This is war. I trust that each of you has learned a lesson from this. As you may know, I have been an inveterate smoker for 20 years. But last night when we sank this sub, I stopped smoking. I mention this not to urge such stoicism on you, but to let you remind me of my pledge whenever I am tempted to do it again. As your skipper, I am responsible for your lives and thus I cannot afford smoking any longer. Now let us offer a humble prayer for our victims. Though enemy, they died for their nation and thus are deserving of our prayers. After the brief prayer, I called up Akagi, who had spotted the submarine adrift on March 2nd and rewarded him with a bonus of 10 yen from my pocket, a package of towel, soap and cigarettes, and a certificate noting that he had earned 10 priority shore leaves. The meeting ended with an ovation for Akagi. The number of his colleagues thronged about him with congratulations. On March 6, Amatsukaze and Hitsukaze returned to Banjarmasen for fuel, ammunition and supplies. While there I visited the Dutch hospital ship, out of concern for the sailors we had seen adrift near Bowen Island a week earlier. It was a great relief to learn that most of them had been rescued and were in the hospital ship, which was filled with nearly 1,000 prisoners of war. Seeing the men cramped and huddled in the narrow spaces reminded me of my cadet days and the training cruise to America and Europe. Some of these prisoners could be men I had met. It was distressing to watch them and I made an earnest wish never to be captured. The rest of March passed uneventfully. No enemy submarines were reported in the Dutch East Indies during the remainder of the month. On the last day of March, Amatsukaze took part in the seizure of Christmas Island, some 200 miles south of Java. This isolated island was not only in a strategic position, but it contained very rich deposits of phosphorus ore. This operation was the easiest of any I had thus far taken part in or witnessed. There were preliminary bombings by a dozen bombers, and offshore bombardment by 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers. The British garrison surrendered at 7, even before the landings had been completed. Some 100 British troops were taken prisoner. They were put to work loading our empty transports with phosphorus ore stacked high on the pier. A sour note punctuated the second day of this simple operation. At 18:05 on April 1st, I saw in the water an eerie line of foam arrowing toward our flagship, cruiser Naka. This torpedo ran no more than 700 meters at an angle of 50 degrees from Naka's starboard side. The cruiser swerved to starboard but too late. The torpedo hit smack amidship and broke Naka's foremast. The impact and explosion left a 5-meter hole gaping in its hull. Miraculously, however, not a single crewman was killed. Our 4 destroyers and 2 patrol ships ran wildly about, dropping many depth charges in an effort to get the attacking sub, but the enemy fled unscathed. I still marvel at the skill and daring of this submarine. It had sneaked into the narrow area, braving 4 bristling destroyers, and fired its torpedo at extremely close range. Although Naka had taken in 800 tons of water, her watertight compartments held and prevented her sinking. She limped back to Japan under escort of several destroyers. Back in the homeland it took weeks to effect her repairs. Such was the price of complacence. We all shared in this guilt, and I had learned another lesson. The Christmas Island venture marked an anticlimactic end to the first phase of Japanese operations in Southeast Asia. It was followed by a lull of more than a month in the Pacific. On April 3, my ship bade farewell to the limping cruiser Naka near Surabaya and joined the fleet in the Java Sea. We arrived in Batavia the next day and left that afternoon for Makassar, where we had an easy 5 days, while engines and weapons were checked. I allowed my crew to go ashore in shifts. The city was buzzing with activity. Peace was restored and business was normal. Stores were filled with goods of far greater variety than had been available in Japan 6 months before. After the war, many of my countrymen said that Japan should have concluded a peace in the spring of 1942, instead of waiting to swallow Allied peace terms after Japan had been bled white. But in the early months of 1942 there were no thoughts of suing for peace. Indeed, many politicians and military leaders firmly believed that the occupation of Southeast Asia was assured as permanent and that Japan, with the immense resources of this great region, would be invincible. From Makassar we moved to Surabaya, and at last, on April 17, we were ordered to return to Japan. The men were jubilant. Drafted sailors dreamed of discharge and going home. They hoped for an end of war. Officers could hold no such rosy prospects, but they were as happy as the enlisted men at the chance of returning to Japan. We left Surabaya to return to Makassar and the following day joined a group of destroyers escorting transports laden with ore, food and oil for Japan. The voyage was without event but pleasant. When we entered home waters and the islands of Japan loomed on the horizon, everyone jumped with joy. Amatsukaze and the other destroyers quietly entered our home port of Kure on the 2nd day of May. The hundreds of tiny islands dotting the inland sea were a peaceful and welcome sight. Seagulls swooped and cried, and small fishing boats tooted greetings to us. Japan is so different from the tropics. The southern sea is indigo, radiant flowers glare in the broiling sun, and everything is garish. Back in Japan, all colors are sedate and soothing. We had missed the cherry blossoms of early April. But young leaves sprouting on the cherry trees were as much a treat to us as the blossoms. The day after our arrival in Kure I ordered the ship's store to be opened. Duty orders were kept to a minimum so that everyone could take it easy. Lieutenant Guro Iwabuchi, my deputy, went ashore to arrange a ship's banquet. He booked a reservation at the Morisawa restaurant for a 240-man party, and reported, the operator said he was not sure of providing food enough for us, because many other ships are holding similar parties in the city and buying up all available materials. But he has a good supply of liquor. When the evening party was announced, Amatsukaze almost rocked with the joy of her crew. Lots were drawn to select the 10 unlucky men who had to stay behind and guard the ship. The rest of us went ashore at about 1700. The bustling city of Kure was filled with sailors. Streets and sidewalks were jammed. For our banquet, we brought enough canned food to supplement the restaurant's larder. There were only 5 geisha girls to serve our entire party. They were harried enough just trying to keep the more than 200 guests supplied with food and drink. To add to their chore, these few girls had also to entertain us with singing and dancing. But free-flowing drinks soon saturated the guests and many enlisted men were soon volunteering to help the girls. My boys began to sing and dance. In the course of the evening practically every one of my men came to offer me an individual toast. I responded to every well-wisher. I don't know how much sake I consumed in the process. Nothing but my rugged physique pulled me through the chain drinking that lasted until the banquet ended around midnight. On the following day, 3 to 6 day leaves were authorized for all hands. The first third of the crew left for home that day, and I boarded a night train for my home. My heart brimmed with joy as the train reached Kamakura in the morning of May 4th. It was a perfect day. Balmy sea breezes rustled the graceful pine trees covering this 800-year-old city. The family was waiting to greet me on the station platform. Little Makito, almost 3, trotted with a hand in his mother's, shouting, "Daddy, Daddy." I hugged him. He had grown so fast during my absence. Daughters Yoko, 12, and Keiko, 9, shouted, "Welcome home." My wife, Chizu, smiled happily. My home was only a 20-minute walk from the station, but I felt that this was a triumphant homecoming and hired a cab for the occasion. The children were wide-eyed, for they seldom rode in a taxi. Back home we opened packages of presents I had brought from the south. The children shrieked with joy at sight of chocolates, a rare treat in those days. In the evening Mr. Tanzan Ishibashi, our good neighbor of many years, came to offer his congratulations. At his invitation, the family went to his home for dinner. Ishibashi was editor-publisher of the magazine Toyo Keizai Oriental Economist. I knew him as a man of rare insight and wisdom, but never dreamed that he would one day be Prime Minister of Japan. We enjoyed the dinner, and afterward I sat drinking sake with him. Being an economist, he was eager to hear of the situation in Southeast Asia. Is our Navy powerful enough to control these vast areas and secure their rich resources for Japan's industrial workshops? He asked. With a man of his caliber there was no point in trying to hide the truth. We have won a series of battles simply because the enemy outblundered us, I replied. You know as well as I do of the immense productive capacity of the Allies. There is no room for optimism for Japan in this war. He was stunned by what I had to say. Censorship was so complete that he was unaware of many of the facts of this war. In 1956, just before he became Prime Minister, my book of war experiences was published in Japan. Ishibashi wrote an introduction for the volume that made me blush. He wrote that our talk that evening in 1942 convinced him that I was more than an ordinary Navy officer. The 6-day leave passed quickly. Orders for my new assignment, calling for instant departure, might come at any time. Once orders were issued, there would be no time for an overnight trip to Kamakura. In order to be with my family as long as possible, I took them back with me to Kure on May 10. The children got a kick out of their first journey, especially when we registered in a hotel. When things were easy, we strolled in the streets or climbed the hills surrounding the city. The Officers' Club delighted my family because it still served rich meals unavailable in town. My children talked about the club dinners for many years, particularly in the days of privation just after the Japanese surrender. Jimmy Doolittle's surprise air raid on Japan in April was quickly forgotten. The B-25 bombers did very little damage. The army announced that all of the attacking planes were shot down. Japan was so drunk with her own great victories and vast conquests that the Doolittle raid was no more than a flea bite. 4 days after my return to Kure, sweeping reassignments came for most of my crew. Practically all of my officers and half of the petty officers and men were transferred. Every day saw my experienced officers and men leaving for new ships, and new officers and recruits arriving to replace them. Such changes were going on throughout the Navy. I could not imagine what the High Command was thinking. My trained crew was being broken up, and I resented it. Other skippers felt the same way. It would take at least 2 months to drill into shape this conglomeration of new men who had never worked together. And what would happen if we were called into action before they were ready? When the Midway operation plan was revealed on May 20, I thought the High Command must have lost its mind. This surprising news was whispered to me at the Kure Naval Station by Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka. I gasped. What does this mean, Admiral? I stammered. Are we going to conduct it with this crew? Said Tanaka dispiritedly. As a matter of fact, I am not sure about it. I hope it's untrue. Tanaka's flotilla of 1 cruiser and 6 destroyers sailed quietly from Kure on May 21. We went at 20 knots toward Saipan where specific orders awaited us. The day after leaving Kure, I heard angry shouts and the sound of someone being hit, and I went out on deck. Their Lieutenant Kazuo Shimizu, the new gunnery officer, was ranting at a sailor. As the hapless man stood there penitently, Shimizu hit him blow after blow with his fist. I was astonished. What's going on? I demanded. Shimizu turned toward me, his eyes still glowing with rage. Commander, this man saw me but failed to salute, he spluttered. I am disciplining him. Is that right? I turned to the petty officer. That is correct, sir, he replied shamefully, his face flushed from the beating he had taken. I was shocked to discover that the man was Akagi, the expert spotter who had been cited for his discovery of an enemy submarine near Surabaya. I dismissed him with a strong warning, and asked Shimizu to come to my cabin. He looked bewildered, but followed me without saying a word. I closed the door of my cabin and offered Shimizu, standing at ramrod attention, a chair. I was distressed at the scene but tried my best to restrain myself. Shimizu, you may smoke if you wish. This is a man-to-man talk, not between a skipper and his gunnery officer. I don't want to criticize you or defend this sloppy man. But I must make it clear that I do not subscribe to maintenance of discipline by physical punishment. I don't know what your former skipper's policy was, but it is my belief that a destroyer crew must maintain perfect teamwork if they are to fight most efficiently. The 250 men of this ship must work as one man. They must be knit together in real harmony and friendship. Shimizu saw what I was driving at. He looked down unhappily, but not without showing his disagreement. Maintenance of good teamwork and proper order is not easy. But I have done it without resorting to corporal punishment. It is hard, but worthwhile. If it is too hard for you, report to me for decision, the next time you are faced with a disciplinary situation. Shimizu kept looking down in silence. I rang and asked my orderly to summon the 3 other department heads. All were new to my command. Lieutenant Shigeo Fujisawa, the chief engineer, Lieutenant Masatoshi Miyoshi, chief torpedo officer, and Lieutenant Kinjiro Matsumoto, chief navigator, quickly came to the cabin. They stood at attention, apparently alarmed at the sudden call. I have just seen Shimizu strike a sailor, I said. Since he did this in the open, I conclude that such things are taking place generally in this ship. I will not permit physical beatings of my crewmen. It must stop as of this moment. You have your orders. The officers withdrew, and there was a bad taste in my mouth. I was helplessly angry. With my crewmen living under such conditions, how could I possibly build the kind of teamwork needed for the important operation which confronted us? I recalled my experiences at Iwo many years before, and still could not forgive the tyrants who had beaten me so freely. To beat men like cattle merely deprives them of the initiative so necessary in a destroyer which must be manned by a closely knit team. Only thus can a crew work with the split-second efficiency demanded in destroyer operations. I decided to spend every spare moment in personal inspections of the ship. I heard angry voices, but saw no more physical discipline. Still I brooded about going into action with this unblooded crew. The 1,400-mile voyage, however, was quiet, and we reached Saipan on the morning of May 25. 16 transports from Truk laden with 3,000 Army and 2,800 Navy troops had already arrived. Also in the harbor were more than a dozen sub-chasers, patrol ships, minesweepers and tankers. At a tactical conference of skippers and commanders the following day, the Midway operation was officially announced. Documents containing details of the operation were handed to each officer. We thus received the orders assigning us to escort the Midway invasion forces. The Midway operation plan went into effect on May 26, 1942. On the following day, the Nagumo Task Force sortied from the inland sea destination Midway. The landing troops escorted by our destroyers left Saipan in the evening of May 28. Anticipating that enemy submarines were watching, we took a feint course to the west, then turned south from a spot directly west of Tinian. Simultaneous with our departure, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's squadron of 3 cruisers and 2 destroyers left Guam. The mainstay of the combined fleet led by the new super battleship Yamato departed the inland sea on the 29th. The previous day, when our convoy had departed from Saipan, was auspicious as the 37th anniversary of Japan's 1905 victory over the Russian fleet at Tsushima Strait. A good omen, but instinctively I felt that something was wrong with this operation, and my heart was not buoyant. The next 6 days passed monotonously. At about 0600 on June 3, one enemy floatplane was spotted a few miles ahead. It went away after a short time, but there was no doubt that this plane had notified Midway of our approach. We were then 600 miles southwest of Midway. In the late afternoon several large planes appeared from the south. Tanaka's flagship Jintsu opened fire and the enemy planes went away. They returned when the guns stopped, and Jintsu reopened its ineffective fire. The planes finally went away, but these actions were unnerving to us, as we were without air cover. The enemy planes came back at dusk and this time swooped head-on at us, so that they were identifiable as 9 B-17 flying fortresses. All destroyers opened fire, throwing the enemy's timing off. Bombs arcing down from the 4-engined bombers fell 1,000 meters away. They turned around and went away, none hit by our shells. Later that night, 4 enemy planes sneaked in and launched torpedoes, one of which pierced the bow of oiler Akabono Maru, killing 11 men and injuring 13 others. Watertight compartments held and the tanker was able to keep pace with the slow transports. We were well aware that we were advancing against a fully prepared enemy, but I was no longer ill at ease. The attempts thus far against our convoy had been furtive and feeble. The Nagumo task force could smash the enemy with its sledgehammer blows. Dawn of June 5 brought murky weather with low, heavy clouds everywhere. There was practically no wind. As I stood on Amatsukaze's bridge, my eyelids were heavy after a sleepless night. Breakfast was delivered while I brooded at the weather which would make it difficult to oppose planes that might suddenly emerge from the low clouds. I was alerted by a shout from the radio room voice tube. "Commander, our main task force is sending out many urgent messages." "All right, bring them to me promptly as each one comes in." Within moments an orderly came running to the bridge and handed me a piece of paper. I scanned it, held my breath and froze. The message was from carrier Kaga and read, "We have been bombed and are afire." Rapidly succeeding messages reported effective attacks delivered against carriers Soryu and Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's own flagship. 3 carriers including the flagship set afire almost simultaneously. What was I reading? Was I dreaming? I shook my head. No, I was wide awake. I groaned and handed the messages to my officers. Lieutenant Shimizu's hands trembled as he read them. Lieutenant Matsumoto paled. Lieutenant Miyoshi was a study in incredulity. I looked around. Our convoy zigzagged on its way. Other skippers and their officers must be reading the same shocking news. Staggering as these reports were, we had to continue as scheduled, having received no orders to the contrary. The horrifying reports continued until there was no room for doubting their accuracy. The mighty Nagumo task force was being cut to ribbons. Still we received no change of orders. What was our high command doing? My grief over our carrier losses abruptly turned into black anger. Were we to fall into the trap as the main task force had done? Damn! Damn! Operation Order No. 154 finally arrived at 0920 instructing our transports to turn northwestward temporarily, and all the fighting ships to attack the enemy north of Midway. The small escort vessels and 16 transports turned slowly from the formation and headed north. Our 6 destroyers and 1 cruiser boosted speed to 30 knots and raced toward Midway Island. Even on this windless day, my speeding destroyer kicked up ocean waves sending showers of spray and foam to the bridge. But now I felt no exhilaration. At 10:10 Operation Order No. 156 announced postponement of the Midway occupation plan and directed us to carry out offshore bombardment of Midway's ground installations. We were still 300 miles from Midway, and 10 hours seemed like a long time in approaching an alerted enemy target. We continued toward the goal without incident except for the continually depressing reports from the front. At 14:30 on June 4, word came from Hiryu, the last of Nagumo's operational carriers, saying, "We have been bombed and set afire." And at 16:15 Admiral Isoroka Yamamoto issued his third order of the day directing the remnants of Nagumo's force to engage the enemy in night battle. This order not only did not mention the loss of all Nagumo force carriers, but it insisted that the enemy fleet had been practically destroyed and is retiring eastward. Even with my limited view of events in this battle, I did not understand how Yamamoto could have issued that order. It now appears that he was trying to prevent the morale of his forces from collapsing, but at the time I thought he must have taken leave of his senses. At 21:30 Nagamo radioed a report which ironically bared the falsehoods of the Yamamoto order. The enemy force of 5 carriers, 6 cruisers, and 15 destroyers moving westward. We are withdrawing northwestward escorting Hiryu. It took 2 hours for Yamamoto to issue his next order, still insisting on strikes at the enemy. This reached me as I watched a ship burning fiercely some 5,000 meters to the east. We checked its position on the chart and determined that this was Akagi. I recalled the sight of an enemy ship burning in the Java Sea. This time it was our flagship. What a difference! In the Java Sea battle the Allies outblundered the Japanese, but at Midway only the Japanese blundered. Shortly before midnight we received orders announcing an end to the Midway operation and instructing us to join with Yamamoto's main force. The Midway battle is termed the point at which the tide of the Pacific War turned in favor of the United States. Nagumo suffered a crushing defeat at Midway, to be sure, but that did not mean the entire collapse of the Navy. Yamamoto's combined fleet was intact, and Japan still had at least 4 carriers to match those of the U.S. Navy. What really spelled the downfall of the Imperial Navy, in my estimation, was the series of strategic and tactical blunders by Yamamoto after Midway, the operations that started with the American landing at Guadalcanal in early August, 1942. After the sour ending of the Midway operation, Yamamoto took his combined fleet to Truk and then back to the homeland. When the Americans hit Guadalcanal, the mainstay of Yamamoto's combined fleet was anchored near Kure in the Inland Sea, 2,700 miles from the battle zone. Throughout the crucial operations around Guadalcanal, Yamamoto flung into the area one small fleet unit after another. His strategy seems ridiculous when judged by hindsight. How did it develop? I rejoined the convoy of transports some 600 miles north of Midway on June 10, and helped to escort them to Truk, where we arrived on the 15th. 2 days later, we all left for Japan. We arrived in Yokosuka June 21, and moved up to Kure 3 days later. All personnel were ordered not to talk about Midway. The real details of the battle were labeled top secret even to commanding officers. It seemed that the order called for absolute belief in the Imperial Headquarters communique, discounting Japanese losses, exaggerating American ones, and insisting that the battle had ended in a Japanese victory. The combined fleet returned to the quiet of the inland sea, but not because it needed repairs. Serious wounds had been sustained by the Nagumo task force, but other major units were practically undamaged. Yamamoto wanted to train his men after the sweeping reshuffle of a month earlier. Yamamoto and the Navy High Command in Tokyo had not had the slightest suspicion that the Americans would launch a major offensive at Guadalcanal within 2 months after the Midway battle. They believed that it would be mid-1943 at the earliest before the Americans could mount an offensive.